I don't know about you guys, but it seems to me like in every single one of my games, someone on the team is just blaming the support for absolutely no reason. The ADC is always pissed at them for sucking at laning. The mid laner is asking why they didn't get roams. Everyone else is asking why we don't have wards, and holy shit, it just never ends. Trust me, as a jungle main, I totally feel for you. I think those two roles are just prone to getting the most flack from their teammates. Well, why did I pick these roles to play? I don't know, maybe I'm a masochist. Anyways, I'm here to tell you that it's not your fault. Well, probably not at least. However, there is one simple change you can make that will turn around the way your teammates see you, and even get the other team to notice that you're maybe a smurf sometimes. Side tangent, I don't even think people assume that when someone on the other team gets fed that they're smurfing. Most of the time, they just think their team is so bad that the other team got fed for absolutely no reason. And yeah, that really says a lot about how League players view their teammates. It's inconceivable that you lost to the enemy being good. It's just that everyone is bad and your teammates are the worst players alive and they all deserve to be put in jail for losing lane while you played absolutely f***ing perfectly. I just can't even comprehend how they could be so. Let's just move on from that. This is why everyone hates supports, and junglers too, and how to fix it. To start, we can take a look at a student of mine who is having me review a Kha'Zix game that he played the other day. After counter-jungling away the enemy's red buff, he has his eyes set onto a bot lane gank. With the enemies pushed up and no jungler on their side to defend them, surely this is a great opportunity, right? He pings the maximum amount of times that the game will let him, and then goes in to execute his masterful plan. Except, well, it doesn't really end up being that great. I completely 110% would blame Alistar here for not just flash engaging on the Ashe at literally any point during this, because I don't think I need to explain how easy this should have been. However, that would be in the case of competitive, not solo queue. In solo queue, we have to take into account that our teammates are not able to be controlled by us, and we have little to no say in what they do, even if we attempt to communicate with them. Because of this, we need to place the blame on ourselves at every point. Once Kha'Zix leaps in and gets Ashe's flash, he is perfectly capable of seeing that Alistar is half a screen away with his monitor off. We really can't blame him for that because why does it matter? It's not productive at all for us to get mad that our support isn't making a play we thought should be super easy to see. The reality of the situation is that he just isn't, and there's nothing we can do to change it. We have to accept that the current situation is what it is and just evaluate how to play it. Now, Kha'Zix should be happy that he got Ashe's splash and start walking back towards his team since he didn't have the required follow to continue. Instead, he got frustrated that his ally ignored all 6 pings and kept trying to make the play anyways, because by all means this play should have worked. Here's the thing. I'm not saying that Kha'Zix needed to just be a Buddhist monk and that Alistar is totally in the right. I would be lying if I also didn't get extremely annoyed by the support sometimes not following through with plays that I think are obvious. And you can watch me firsthand do the exact same thing I just told you all not to do. Thresh is already going towards topside, so to me it seems perfectly logical to use his moves, evade, and win. I'm going to make a play with Thresh here. Okay. I felt super strong here being 6-0 and having a massive lead over everyone in the game. But I acknowledge that Thresh wasn't going to come and still did this play anyways. Maybe I just did anyways. I kind of knew Game was here, but I thought he'd be like, yeah, I just wish my Thresh came with me. It's still my fault, but like, I don't know. At the very least, I know that this was ultimately my fault because I'm playing solo queue, and I have eyes to see that my Thresh wasn't coming with me even though I spam ping. I should have just backed up to go farm my Krugs or recall for Dragon, but I really got stuck on the fact that I thought my idea was right and fell victim to it. The point that I'm getting at is that it's human nature to think your play is right. And when someone doesn't help you make a play that you think is really obvious, you're going to be kind of annoyed. Even if your teammates are going to rage and sometimes AFK. And it's worth noting that this guide is made by the only platform that actually teaches solo queue how it should be played for those who want to climb, from the low elo perspective. The game literally needs to be played completely differently in gold, for example, than what you'll see on high elo streams or pro play if you want to climb quickly and effectively, playing with the worst and most annoying teammates imaginable who are seemingly allergic to the play. So, if you want guides that help you climb stupidly fast, packaged into incredible courses for every concept, then check out Skill Caps after this. There's no reason not to, as there's no risk. Anyways, we can sit here all day and argue about what play is technically correct, but we are all playing solo queue, not competitive. It doesn't matter what the correct play is because we don't have the ability to convince our teammates that we're right, nor should we even care. Our entire job is to look at the situation at hand and problem solve how to make that the highest percentage chance to win. Whether or not it's right doesn't matter at all. At this point, Thresh's highest probability play is to sit behind me and plays land me out if I get into danger, and potentially follow up on a fight if it doesn't go. Likewise, my best play is to just see that he's going to go back bottom and not invade like I initially wanted. In either situation, both plays will work as long as we are just on the same page. The problem is, and the reason why everyone hates junglers and supports, is that your terrible teammates aren't going to have the awareness to recognize this fact and suck up their own ego to admit that they didn't do the one thing that would help them win. They just stuck to their play and got pissed that you didn't help them. Tops and ADCs are mostly free from this scrutiny because they're in lane farming most of the game away, but us supports and junglers are running around constantly expected to make plays with other people. Unfortunately, these other people only see things their way and are definitely not going to have the self-awareness to admit to themselves that there is another way to play the game. You all just watched me, a literal challenger player, not follow my own advice, but at least I knew in the end that it was on me. Your teammates are not going to feel this way and will just assume that you are trying to put the game down because you didn't follow up on their ping. So the best way to play support isn't even the right way. It's actually just to look at what your teammates are trying to do and always figure out a way to make that play not fall on its metaphorical face. This game is a plat game I played while smurfing, and after Caitlyn satisfies my praise quota for the day, I need to do some problem solving. Our reset timer here should be like one plate and then out. We want a little bit of advantage, and even hitting this, they're ahead of us in terms of tempo, but because we're taking the dragon right now, they're really not going to be able to get much out of it, but I still want to bully them on the bounce back here and make sure that we can pressure. Okay, because Caitlyn's staying, I'm just going to stay, and we're just going to push this in. It's unfortunate that we're just going to die back. It's a really bad timer, but I guess it's going to work anyways. Give that a go. Guess we can just do that. You should have waited like 2 seconds for the wave, and then that's way more guaranteed. I didn't think it's a bad idea, it's just that you rush into everything. This play ended up working out pretty well, but it's only because I scrapped my initial idea of recalling and fighting my opponents around in order to stay and babysit my ADC. At this moment in time, I had no way of knowing that my fiddle was going to even look for the dive. So my best course of action is to try and do the play that will let us win, even without jungle help. By just basing early, we would be able to come back to lane with item advantage and just kill them as they try to crash the next wave. Unfortunately, even though I ping Caitlyn, she continues to hit tower, and at that point, I know I have to stay. If I had stuck to my initial idea of basing, Fiddle could have just gone for this anyways without me, or Caitlyn could have just died in the 2v1. Of course, things end up working out because Fiddle does look for the dive and all three of us are on the same page. But I needed to abandon my initial idea due to my team's action. It doesn't matter what play is best or right, it just matters that we all went for the same thing. I use this multiple times per game. Pretty much whenever I have an idea of my own, I'm just going to ping for it. But if no one looks like they're following, I'm going to my teammates' ideas instead to make sure they don't int. I'll take this off the map again, I'm just going to keep using it. If my team doesn't come, it's okay. I'll just follow up on their ideas. That's all I can do. Ultimately, it takes a little longer than I wanted for my team to come to Herald, but they do eventually. It just requires some patience, and I can't just rush the idea and start it because I could leave them completely vulnerable on accident. When you abandon the idea of a right play and instead shift your mindset to just go for the play that gives you the highest chance to win in your situation, it tends to just be that working with your teammates will produce the best results. And as a side effect of this, they're going to like playing. It's pretty rare that supports get acknowledged in solo queue, but when I smurf, I constantly get complimented, and it's probably because I'm just implementing this into my games. My teammates feel like I'm always there to help them because I am, and in their heads, that's what true support really is. Let us know how you implement this into your game and what the results are. Alright guys, friendly reminder to get on the skill challenge right now if you're serious about improving. And as always, thanks for watching.
destroyed a turret. An enemy has been slain. An ally has been slain. Your team has destroyed a turret. Your team down. An enemy has been slain. An ally has been slain. Has been slain. An enemy has been slain. Aced. to Summoner's Rift. Seconds until minions spawn. Minions have spawned. An enemy has been slain. has destroyed a turret. Your team has destroyed a turret.
with his
who focuses on human happiness. He's a professor of the practice of public leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School and professor of management practice at the Harvard Business School. He is also the best-selling author of 12 books and the creator of the popular How to Build a Life column in The Atlantic. He previously served for 10 years as president of the American Enterprise Institute and most recently he's the author of the book From Strength to Strength, Finding Success, Happiness, and Deep Purpose in the Second Half of Life. And that is what we get into in this conversation. We talk about what it takes to build a good life, the perverse power of social comparison, taboos around talking about intelligence, political dignity and ethical hierarchy. We talked for a while about the Dalai Lama and our mutual experience of him, the nature of love, fluid and crystallized intelligences, the strange case of Linus Pauling, the limits of identity. And then in the second half, we have a spirited discussion about atheism and religion. Arthur's a devout Roman Catholic. I am not. And we get into that a little. We talk about the fear of death, psychedelics, existentialism, St. Thomas Aquinas, and other topics. Anyway, I enjoyed this. This is an example of the kind of conversations I'm having more and more over in the life section of Waking Up, but I'm presenting it here too because I think it will be of general interest to all of you. And I bring you Arthur Brooks. I am here with Arthur Brooks. Arthur, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Sam. What a delight. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time.
Yeah. We've. I know we know many people in common, but I don't think we've ever met. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not aware of having met you anywhere.
I agree. I think it's absolutely right.
Yeah.
I feel like I know you though. I've listened to you so much.
Well, I loved your latest book, which we'll discuss. The title of which is From Strength to Strength. And I think we'll focus on that for most of the discussion. But catch me up on what you have done. So it's relevant to the conversation about your book, but how do you describe your professional and intellectual history? What have you focused on and get to the present?
It's peripatetic. I haven't actually done the same thing year after year after year like a lot of people have in my profession. I'm an academic like you on the world of academia, but I came late to it. I started my career after being unceremoniously ushered to college at age 19 as a professional musician. I started as a professional classical French horn player. I went on tour for a long time, through my 20s. My parents called it my gap decade, and they were none too pleased about it. My father was a college professor, as was his father. And I wound up in the Barcelona Symphony, playing in the symphony orchestra there until my late 20s. And then I actually went back to college by correspondence. I didn't have enough money or time to do it personally. And finished my bachelor's degree at 30 and started graduate school and got very interested in social sciences, just the behavior of how what made people tick, and weirdly became an economist. Started my PhD and for 10 years. Then left after 10 years, most of it at Syracuse, to be the president of a think tank in Washington, D.C. called the American Enterprise Institute, one of the oldest think tanks and largest think tanks in the world. And after doing that for 10 years, I retired in my mid-50s and came to Harvard, where I've been for the past 3 years teaching at the business school and the Kennedy School, where I teach the science of happiness, mostly to MBA students.
Nice. Well, I want to circle back to the several of the transitions there. You and I actually have a slightly similar background in having taken the decade of our 20s off from the usual academic grind, only to return to it and do things backwards. But so when you were at AEI, what years were you running at AEI?
I took over AEI in the last month of the George W. Bush administration, and I finished in the middle of 2019. So I came on the first day of 2009, and then I left in June of 2019. 10 and a half years.
I forget. So were you running it when Ayaan Hirsi Ali joined, or was that?
No, she was there. We were coincident for a while. She joined under my predecessor, and she was there with me, and then we did a lot of stuff together as when she was a non-resident fellow.
Okay, yes. Though my politics have always diverged considerably from AEI, I have a soft spot for the organization because it was literally the only foundation that would take Ayaan when she was really desperate for refuge, leaving the Netherlands and incurring all of the security concerns around her apostasy, and AEI saved her, and so I was incredibly grateful at that moment, being one of her friends.
Yeah, no, it's an organization dedicated to intellectual apostates, sort of literal apostates like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, but also just the intellectual apostates, weird people who think differently, because look, this is what makes life interesting, and a competition of ideas really is fundamental to a free society. The idea of conventional thinking is antithetical to progress as far as we're concerned, and so I was really dedicated to that principle. I was looking for weirdos, quite frankly, people who are going to break up convention.
Yeah. Okay. So let's start with your book, and maybe we can start with the way you actually start your book. I mean, you have this anecdote that is kind of the founding inspiration and epiphany for your book. Perhaps you can tell that and link it up with the various transitions you've made in your life.
Yeah, I started the book by telling a story that had a kind of a foundational impact on me, because it was about halfway through my time as president of this think tank. And it was a great job. I mean, I was working my tail off. I was traveling around giving maybe 175 speeches a year, and I was fundraising like crazy. I had to raise $50 million a year. It's like, my job was like running for the Senate and never getting elected, which probably is better than getting elected. But about halfway through, 5 years or so, I was having this mild existential crisis. What does this lead to? What am I actually trying to do? I'm going to do my work, do it better, be more successful, I suppose, or at least create more impact and value for society as I saw it. But then what? I mean, sooner or later I'll get a shove, or I'll get tired, or something will stop. And what does this mean, basically? What's the cadence of this? And around the time I was on a plane and had overheard this conversation. Now, you and I, as social scientists, know that our real laboratory is overheard conversations. It's the conversation on the plane. It's the people talking behind you at Starbucks. That's where that's where the interesting ideas come from. And I heard a conversation with a couple, an elderly couple, and a couple of men. You could tell it was a man and a woman. And I assumed they were married because they were putting in the conversation. And I couldn't see him. It was nighttime and dark. But I heard the husband kind of mumble a little bit, and then the wife say, "Don't say it would be better if he was dead." And now they really have my attention. I mean, I'm just keyed in at this point. I'm not trying to eavesdrop, but who wouldn't be listening at this point? And then he mumbles a little bit more. She says, "It's not true that nobody cares about you and nobody remembers you." And I'm thinking that this is probably somebody who's not like you, Sam, or the people listening to your program. This is not somebody who was super motivated. It's probably somebody who's disappointed because he didn't get the education that he wanted and start the business or get the jobs that he wanted. And now it's near the end and he's disappointed. Well, we were coming from LA to Washington. The flight was on a lot in those days. And we land in Washington maybe an hour later, and the lights go on and we all stand up, and I'm curious. So I turn around just to get a look at the disconsolate guy. And it's one of the most famous men in the world. I mean, this guy is rich and famous because of things that he did in the 60s and 70s. And he's very old, but he's super well known. I mean, people recognize him. And as we were leaving the plane, he's right behind me, coming up the aisle, and the pilot stops him and says, recognizes him, of course, and says, "Sir, you've been my hero since I was a little boy." And I turned around and he's beaming with pride. And I'm thinking to myself, so which is it? Which is the real guy? The one beaming with pride right now, or the one confessing to his wife that he might as well be dead? And I thought to myself, the world has a kind of a bogus formula for success, actually, which is what I had been suffering under and which I just had witnessed. That if you want to be happy, you want to die happy, Sam, here's the deal. Work hard, succeed, bust your pick, bank your success, die happy. And it's wrong. It's not true. And we all kind of know it's not true, but I saw this in stark relief, and I started actually reading biographies differently at that point of great men and women throughout history to see if they died happy, and a lot of them didn't. And it sent me on this quest to figure out what was this curse. A lot of people were very successful, that they tended to be very unhappy at this point. And what could somebody do to build what amounts to a happiness 401k plan? I was going to turn to my social scientist toolkit on the business of getting happier as you get older, and that's the book that we're talking about.
And this curse is something you call the striver's curse.
Yeah.
But this insight into the problem visited you earlier than is really the central lesson of your book. Your book, as we will see, focuses on inevitable changes that come with aging, but you kind of slammed up against a brick wall in music, in your late 20s. Just maybe describe that and talk about what those implications were for you.
Well, one of the things that I talk about in the book is one of the reasons that strivers, really hard workers, ambitious people, why they struggle and suffer often in their life is because what they're good at, they can't keep doing forever, that there is inevitable decline. And I talk about the neuroscientific basis of that. I mean, there's very strong neuroscientific science for why that's the case. But I also have some personal experience with decline. I've experienced decline, not the kind that comes in midlife, but I had a weird decline in my musical career that gave me a taste of how bitter it actually is. I had all I ever wanted to be as a kid was a French horn player. I wanted to be the world's greatest French horn player, which is kind of a weird ambition, I realized, but nonetheless, it was my ambition. And as I went through my teenage years, it seemed like that was actually within reach, or something like it was within reach, because I was just getting better every year, and my career was going well, and I was playing professionally. And then something happened in my early 20s where I started getting sick. This happens to people that rely on gross and fine motor skills a lot. And there's a lot of possible physiological or even neurological explanations for it, but it's not well understood why some athletes, why they burn out early, why some classical musicians peak and decline. But I was, and by the time I was 22, I was finding that things that used to be easy were hard, and things that used to be hard were impossible. And I was noticing this decline all the way through my mid-20s. So I was trying desperately. I was going to the teachers. I was practicing more and more. I took different jobs. I wound up in the symphony in Barcelona because I thought that maybe this kind of job, this kind of playing would re-spark my ascent as a French horn player. And of course it didn't. And, it really took it took getting married to somebody who was kind of my guru to help me understand that I was not a French horn player. I was a person. I was a human being that happened to play the French horn. That had never occurred to me because I was a classic success-addicted self-objectifier, which is one of the things I talk about a lot in the book. The whole thing back hopelessly because of success. And I was too, and it took somebody who really loved me for who I was as a person as opposed to what I was professionally to help me do something else.
What's the normal pattern of decline for musicians of that sort?
The normal pattern of decline is that you would get better all the way through your 20s and into your 30s, so your technique would actually get better. And then you'd peak as a French horn player. Ordinarily, your technique would peak in your late 30s, and you start to see pretty gradual decline in your 40s and 50s. And if you're truly a prodigy, even in your 60s and 70s, you can be playing very, very beautifully. But your best playing will typically be in your late 30s. And that had happened to me in my early 20s for, whatever reason. There may have been an injury that had gone undetected or whatever reason. I guess I was just precociously in decline. And it gave me, by the way, Sam, it was a blessing because it gave me an opportunity to retool and, go back to school and learn something new. But I was so tied to it that I didn't even tell anybody I'd done college. I was ashamed that anybody would know that I was studying. And, it was a real secret. Literally the only person who knew was my wife and none of my colleagues. I remember one time in the music world that we were, hanging around. And there was this one woman, she was a pretty good French horn player, but she came and said, I got big news. I just got a full scholarship to go to medical school in Miami. I'm going to become a surgeon. And after she left the room, we're like, see, she doesn't matter.
Talk about a low status job, a surgeon. Yeah, if you're among French horn players, that's funny. It's questions of status are essential here, and the questions of identity. What you're describing is your identity was entirely anchored to this notion of you being an increasingly wonderful musician. And when that began to erode, you became increasingly uncomfortable for obvious reasons.
Right.
I mean, even just in the story you just described, one sense of identity, you point out in the book, is notions of success that can create around it are, for the most part, in relation to others, and they're born of social comparison, they're born of notions of status, explicit or implicit, so they're positional, and yet there are multiple axes for these kinds of comparisons and status judgments, and so it's kind of, we're both laughing when we describe the elitism of the French horn players looking down on lowly surgeons, but of course surgeons would return the favor. And I think it's probably happened to you, there are many contexts in which you find yourself in the company of highly successful people, and you witness various status games and witness what they do to your own self-concept. But these comparisons occur and combine and recombine in strange ways. You can be an academic who may feel kind of low status compared to some other academics, but higher status with respect to the variable of education around people who just have a lot of money. And there's at least a dozen ways you can kind of point the arrow of your self-regard so as to compare yourself to those around you. And it is really the lesson in the end is that all of this is fatuous and not the basis for a durable feeling of well-being or a sense that one is living a meaningful life.
Absolutely. And we can even find stranger versions of it today. I mean, we talk about on college campuses or any place, there are people who get their sense of identity and their sense of hierarchy of identity with respect to their grievance, their sense of victimhood. Yeah. And so it's kind of like, people will often say on college campuses, like the victim companies in some cases. And what that is about is, nothing to make light of, because there are legitimate grievances to be sure, but to the extent that we say one group is more aggrieved than another group, that's the same thing as saying that a good French horn player has less status somehow than a B. It's just, it gets very exotic very quickly and is pretty unhelpful and pretty unconstructive for living a life.
So in the book you make much of two different types of intelligence and the time course of their decline. Maybe we should jump into that. Perhaps we could acknowledge up front that intelligence itself is a somewhat taboo topic. And even to acknowledge that it is unequally distributed in the world is taboo. I mean, it's there for all to notice. And however you want to define intelligence, even if we admit that how you define it may be open to some cavilling, whatever definition you have something that is implicitly hierarchical, and it's just there is no definition that renders everyone equivalent. And yet it's strange that it's taboo to acknowledge that. I mean, it's not at all taboo to acknowledge that some French horn players are better than others, or some athletes are better than others. And yet, to talk in any straightforward way about someone being smarter than someone else, that makes everyone uncomfortable. Do you have a sense of why that is?
Well, part of it is that we've made the mistake for a very long time of equating intelligence with moral superiority. I mean, how many parents would compliment their kids by saying you're so smart? I mean, it's that you wouldn't compliment your kid by saying your hair is so long. You wouldn't. I mean, it's just these are, if these are characteristics that vary not just on the basis of your own effort, but by something having to do, for example, with your genetics. Then it's nothing but complimenting. It's like, your eyes are so blue. I mean, what a weird thing to compliment somebody for. I suppose that we could to admire that particular quality, but to equate it with some sort of moral superiority is really important, and yet that's what people have done for the longest time. And if we think that there's an equivalency between intelligence and cognitive ability, for example, and moral superiority, then we're going to be getting into all of this confusion again. Now, there's other ways that people have, in our yours and mine, have talked about it that's less controversial. For example, in my book, I talk about the work of Raymond Cattell, who's a social psychologist in the 70s. And Cattell was basically just noticing that there are two types of geniuses, one that blooms early and one that blooms late, and they have different characteristics. They have different strengths that give them these genius characteristics. And then he knows later that these genius characteristics exist in everybody in varying degrees, that you're really good at something early and you're really good at something later. So it's a lot less polemical than the way that we talk about, for example, IQ scores.
Right, yeah, and this is the distinction between fluid and crystallized intelligence that you...
Yeah, exactly.
I just wonder if there's something more to it, and I haven't thought about this much, but, my own relationship to this concept strikes me as peculiar. So, for instance, at no point in my life did I ever think that maybe I should be a professional athlete, right? I mean, the sport I played the most, the team sport I played the most was soccer. I definitely had enough exposure to soccer to discover in myself the aptitude that would lead me to be a professional soccer player. So I think I started playing around age 9. I played straight through high school. I was certainly not a bad soccer player, and even in the context of a little school team, I think I probably thought of myself as a good soccer player. But then I went to college. When I went to Stanford, there was literally not a single neuron in my brain that thought maybe I should try out for the varsity soccer team. It was a good team. I think they even there. I think they beat the Olympic team. So it was a serious soccer team, and I don't even think I consciously closed that door because I never even looked for a door. I mean, it was obvious that my abilities as a soccer player were so bounded that no thought needed to be expended on my future professionally as a soccer player.
Right.
And in no way do I feel diminished by that egoically. That's not my wheelhouse. But when I think about other things left unexplored of that sort, I think, well, if I had applied myself more to mathematics, could I have discovered in myself that I was really a great mathematician? Right? I was obviously exposed to mathematics as much as I was exposed to soccer. Presumably, I was exposed enough to discover whether I was going to be the next Alan Turing or Claude Shannon or Norbert Wiener, or you take your pick. I didn't discover that, and yet I think if, in my crazier moments, I think part of me believes that if I had just pushed into that area, if I had persisted, really the sky was the limit. There's no telling what I could have become in that area. Now, it takes me about 10 seconds to convince myself that is almost certainly bullshit, right? There's no way I, was going to be the next Alan Turing. Just statistically, it's as likely as me being the next LeBron James or some athlete. I never for a moment would think I would stand a chance of being. And yet, it doesn't feel that way. Intelligence is the sort of thing that you feel like, it's very hard to admit to yourself that there is a scale and you are at a certain point on it. Again, define intelligence in as piecemeal a way as you want. You give me 100 different forms of intelligence. Take your pick. You are not the greatest at that one, very likely, right? And yet there's something about that that's hard for people to admit, and it does feel diminishing in a way that just acknowledging you weren't going to be a professional athlete isn't. I don't know what to compare this to. It's a little bit like, as writers, we've run into this. This is a kind of an old saw of writers that basically everyone imagines that they should write a book, right? Everyone imagines that they have a book in them, because everyone's a language user and everyone does some writing, and it's you're constantly bumping into people who think they should be writing a book, whereas you're not bumping into people who think they should be playing the French horn at the highest level. And so maybe intelligence is something like that, where because everyone is using it all day long, it's very hard to think about it being bounded in a way that is invidious.
Yeah, we also have a society that is increasingly giving returns to intellectual ability. I mean, we have a very complex society, and this is, it's one of the things that virtually guarantees that you're going to do well if you're, if you have strong intellectual gifts. And so the result of that is that it's a better thing to have than good lips for playing the French horn. I mean, it's like you have a kid, you say, well, you got two choices. The kid is going to be really gifted intellectually, the kid's going to have an unbelievable embouchure to play the trombone or the French horn or something. You're going to you'd be nuts to say, look, little Johnny's intellectually pretty mediocre, but man, he's got good technique on the trombone. There are very few people that would take that. Maybe my parents would, I'm not sure, but the truth is that it's just that intellectual giftedness is highly fungible across modern society, which has been more and more rewarding that. And a lot of people are putting moats around their castles for that too, making it into a harder and harder society. And this is what it really does. I think it comes down to a question of we all have to recognize the radical equality of human dignity, notwithstanding our differences of all different. And the point that we can't quite recognize that everybody has the same dignity, then we have to be very uncomfortable with differences that people actually have.
Yeah, I think there's a distinction between human dignity and the political equivalence between people. And all people are created equal. That's a political statement. That's the world we want to live in. And yet we know that there are some people who add much more value to society than others, right? And again, it's just whether you want to talk about this in absolute terms or if it's just a contingent fact of what a society happens to value, you're going to find certain people who cater to those desires and demands more than others. And so in a hostage crisis, it is natural to want to rescue, Albert Einstein and Martin Luther King Jr. before you rescue, I don't know, somebody who's has and will do nothing of special value for anyone else. And more resources will be expended upon trying to rescue that person, presumably. Now, we don't want to live in that world. We want to live in a world where we're impartial, or at least there's a pretense of impartiality, more or less across the board, where doctors work as hard as they're ever going to work to save the life of anyone. But as you say, intelligence is this magical property that is incredibly fungible. It's just so useful across the board. Almost anything we want either depends more or less entirely on intelligence, or at least it's safeguarded by intelligence. But, obviously there are many more things, or several more things that are arguably as important or more important. And we'll talk about a few of those things, but there's certainly a dissociation in some people between intelligence and wisdom, and certainly intelligence and a capacity for ethical engagement and love and compassion. And it's the love and compassion and wisdom side of things that wants to build a more egalitarian view of the situation. But I feel like we can't lie to ourselves about there being a kind of ethical hierarchy as well. And make this absolutely clear. There are people who create net harm to society. We put certain people in boxes for the rest of their lives because they're so despicable and dangerous if you let them out of the box. And yet we also give them competent medical care when they need it. How do you think about the situation? Moral worth and dignity versus the gradations of benefit to others that I just get.
Well, yeah, all of these are incredibly nuanced ethical questions that we're trying to live out day to day. And I think it's interesting that we can explore these things in the context of what we want for ourselves and what we want for our kids. So, we tend to prize certain things, certain characteristics above all other things. And in the hierarchy of what we want for our kids, we want our kids to be really successful. We want them to be really smart, and we want them to. But if I gave you two choices, you have a son or a daughter who's a psychopathic genius, or one who is of moderate ability to time. I know that. And what you just told me is those are competing characteristics, and in point of fact, that evidence like kindness is probably more important exposure. And that's an important element of society, where pricing will be more overt about as far as I'm concerned. That's one of the things that I think that we could all probably agree on that would cool a lot of the tension from the conversation. What are the human values that should be, and actually kind of are more important to us than logical than academic performance? And the answer is the extent to which we communicate effortlessly in a loving way towards one another. And that's the sort of benevolence across society, and how we can foster that more in young people. And so that's a lot of what I dedicate my work to doing. As an academic, for example, when I left my think tank, I was discerning what do I want to do the rest of my life. And I decided that I was going to spend the rest of I was mid-50s, 55 years old, and I said I'm going to spend the rest of my life lifting people up and bringing them together in bonds of happiness and love, using my intellect and using my ideas. Because I think that those are higher values than the other things.
Yeah. Although I would just point out that there's an implicit hierarchy even there. I mean, I think it's obvious that some people are more compassionate and wiser and more loving than others.
For sure.
So that's a domain in which any one person can grow, and there's there are methods by which one can grow, across all of those variables. But there's no question that there are ethical prodigies in the world at whatever point in life they fully embody those abilities. And you mentioned a few in your book, and I think you mentioned in your book that you actually had some direct connection with the Dalai Lama. What's that been about?
About 10 years ago, when I was still president of AEI, I started thinking about the people that I wanted to have deep conversations, ethical conversations about big issues of the day, with people whom I really admired morally, people whom I admired spiritually, people who are adroit. And really the person on top of my list is the world's most respected religious leader, who is the Dalai Lama. And so I got in contact with his team and with some of my colleagues at AEI. They granted us an hour with him in Dharamsala, in his monastery in the foothills. It was an arduous journey getting up there, sure, but it was just sort of magic as soon as we met. We started talking, having these big ideas. I invited him to the United States. He came, I interviewed him. We wound up writing together. I interviewed him many times. We've become friends. He's a beloved teacher and friend, and I've learned a great deal from him. I mean, he has a completely different spiritual tradition than me. He sees the world in many ways very differently than me. But what we agree on is this inherent dignity of all people. He reminds me, it's interesting, because he's Tibetan, he's not American. You and I are Americans, and we see things differently. But he'll say, remember, you're 1 in 7 billion people, by which he doesn't mean that I'm a speck, that I'm insignificant, but that there's that we're all part of. I mean, I know that you practice meditation in a very serious way, so the concept of emptiness means something to you. And the whole idea is that there's this koan in Zen Buddhism. What is the sound of one hand clapping? It's almost a cliche at this point. But really what it is, it's the answer to a question. Who am I as an individual? I am the sound of one hand clapping. The truth is that I as an individual with my ideas don't mean very much until my hand clapping comes against the hand of Sam Harris and we have this particular conversation. And it's the Dalai Lama who's helped me understand that my dignity, that doesn't mean very much until it actually meets your dignity together. It's the togetherness that really matters a lot. That has been one of the most valuable relationships in my intellectual and my spiritual development.
Yeah, it's been many years since I've seen him, but I did have some very nice concentrated exposure to him in my, I guess, late 20s. The most substantial was I was invited to be part of a Buddhist group that was arranging his tour of France for a month. And these were people who were some friends who'd been on 3-year retreats, retreat centers in France. And so they were organizing his tour, and it was a fairly arduous tour where he was basically changing cities every 24 or 48 hours for a month. And so you're packing and unpacking and packing and unpacking. And we were his security detail. Unlike in America, he was also given the French Secret Service detail as well, but we were the kind of the buffer between the real bodyguards and the rascal multitude in France. So strangely, we got into much more conflict with people than the real bodyguards did, because they used us as a buffer. But it was a really interesting experience because I got to see what he was like in all of these transitional moments with large groups of people, again and again and again, in a situation where I had to be, like my job was to be paranoid and to be scrutinizing every room looking for a threat, and his job is to be Mr. Compassion and just beam love and good humor at everyone. So it was actually it was a strangely toxic role to be in, because it was just, rather than stay on his channel, you had to be the jerk on some level. And I got to be a jerk with very poor language skills, so that, I didn't even have enough French to be diplomatic. So I'm telling people
there's not enough French in the world to be diplomatic.
and the French, I noticed, often aren't very diplomatic. But I was telling people not to move and back up and barking orders at journalists. It's amazing how rude people can be. And literally, journalists at some point physically grabbed him, wheeled him around in order to get a photo of him. It was completely insane. But what I saw in him was just this ability to, almost without exception, not miss anyone. I mean, he would be exiting a hotel, and there'd be, a dozen or more people just gathered to watch him go, because he was such a celebrity. Again, he's a bigger celebrity in France than he is in the States, at least at that point. And he would just make, it could be, almost instantaneous, but he would make a connection with basically everyone in the room on his way out. And he's just a kind of the ultimate mensch. I guess I could be projecting somewhat on him, but I actually don't. I don't hold him out to be, at the top of the pantheon of meditation masters in Tibetan Buddhism. I mean, in fact, I studied with some of his teachers, and so I've met the people he looked up to, and among Tibetan contemplatives. So it wasn't that. It was just that he was just such a kind and well integrated person in the way he engaged, everyone at every level of society. It was just so admirable. And again, it's some of it could be innate, but you look at how he spends his time. It's not far-fetched to believe that a lot of it has to do with the training he's engaged.
For sure, and I love him. And it's interesting because the model of that kind of kindness and goodness is really quite different than that which we're used to. The Dalai Lama, he's unattached to everything, including to people. He's not attached to people. It's he often talks about his cat. He loves his cat. So it seems. And so one time I asked him, so what's your cat's name? And he looked at me like I was asking him a bizarre question. Like I was asking him, what's your left shoe named? You know what? He says, no name, cat.
Right.
And the whole point is that there's love, and then there's attachment, and love and attachment are not the same thing. And this has been hugely instructive for me because, I have traveled with him as well. I wasn't, doing bad cop like you. Mm-hmm. I've been in the nice situation of actually being able to be, with him and interviewing him and just being with him when he's been on tour. But I've noticed the same thing, that he has this love, this universalism in the love that he has for everybody. And part of it is because he is loving and unattached at the same time. I think this is a standard that's very hard to attain. It's a really hard thing for me to attain, and it's made me reflect an awful lot about how I try to live my life in many ways. One of the things that I find in my own research as a social scientist is, I study a lot the satisfaction problem. I mean, the satisfaction problem, we'll call it the Mick Jagger problem. I can't get no satisfaction. And the truth is, you can't keep no satisfaction. That's the truth. That's, the homeostasis problem, the hedonic treadmill problem. Anybody who listens to your show knows about all these ideas that you try and you try and you try, and you think that the new car smell will last forever, that the marriage will give you permanent satisfaction. Nothing does. And the reason is because Mother Nature just doesn't care if you're happy. And she wants you to pass on your genes and doesn't want you to be satisfied. She wants you to run and run and run, to strive and strive and strive. And the answer to it really comes from detaching love from attachment. That's the really important thing, because if you think of something as the be all and the end all, that you conceive of something as your permanent source of satisfaction, you will always be disappointed. It's okay to love and be non-attached at the same time. How do you do that? Well, that's the trick, isn't it? Ultimately, that's not a question of having more. That's a question of wanting less. And that's one of the great moral lessons that I've learned from the Dalai Lama, and something that I'll probably spend the rest of my life trying to instantiate in the way I live my life.
Yeah, I think you need to unpack what you mean by love and differentiating a few components. I think shows how you could maximize love without any real implication of attachment. And it's Buddhism is, I think, especially useful here in how it differentiates some of these concepts. But there's a term that is usually translated as loving kindness from Buddhism. The Pali Sanskrit is metta. And it really is just the wish for others to be happy. The wish for them to be free of suffering is the compassion variant of that. And for that wish to really be tuned up to something like its maximum, a few things have to be purged, or kind of burned off as impurities there. And one is the sense that you want something from the other people,
Right.
that your happiness is in any way predicated on getting something from them, right? Or that your happiness is in any way competitive with theirs. So another aspect of, another variant of it is called mudita, which is a sympathetic joy, which is, the antithesis of envy, right? So we've all noticed this ghastly quality of mind where, something good happens in the life of a friend, right? They have some great professional success, or, something great happens, and you find in yourself a limit on your capacity to actually be happy for them, right? Because you feel somehow your happiness has been diminished. I mean, it's just a ghastly quality of mind.
Oh, it's the worst. I mean, envy is a deadly sin for that reason. My father was very funny. He used to say that, son, remember, it's not enough to win. Your friends have to lose
Right.
too.
Yeah. I think isn't there a Gore Vidal quote around there, which is just incredibly ugly. I forget what it was.
Every time one of my friends succeeds, I die a little bit inside. I think that's what he
Something
said.
like
Right?
that, yeah.
But there's a Western tradition that gets at this in the same way, that is a little bit easier for most of us to understand, and that comes from Aquinas, who was really paraphrasing Aristotle. So Aquinas, of course, in the 13th century in the Summa Theologica, he was really reintroducing. He was a Neoplatonist, but he reintroduced Aristotle to audiences. We probably wouldn't read the Nicomachean Ethics today were it not for St. Aquinas. And Aquinas defined in an Aristotelian way what love means, which gets at exactly what we're talking about here. He defined love as to will the good of the other as other. I mean, this could have been right out of the mouth of the Buddha. As a matter of fact, he was really impressed and really influenced by many Eastern teachings. And so when you read Aquinas, it's pretty Eastern. But the will of the good of the other, this is not about sentimentality. This is not about feelings, which is really important. When I teach happiness at Harvard Business School, the first day of class, I say, what's happiness? And they start talking about that feeling I get when ... And I say, wrong. Happiness has feelings, but just like the Thanksgiving dinner has a smell. That's evidence of happiness. Happiness has to be something more tangible than that, or you can't improve it. There's not much you can do about it. You shouldn't be taking a class in it, for Pete's sake. And that's really an Aristotelian or a Thomistic concept, very related to the Buddhist ideas that we're talking about here. Do you love somebody? Well, then will their good as that person, and then you're on the road to perhaps becoming able to suffer.
Okay, well, I want to get back to Aquinas and related topics there, but let's go back to intelligence where we left it. We did not actually describe the difference between fluid and crystallized intelligence and the use to which you put these concepts in your book. So tell me, what are your thoughts on that topic?
So Cattell, Raymond Cattell, the social psychologist, great British social psychologist, noticed that people, they get better at things through their 20s and 30s, that kind of 10,000 hours deal, where they have focus, the ability to work hard, a lot of working memory, and almost anything that you can get good at, from being an air traffic controller to being a French horn player to being a college professor, a researcher in particular, that requires innovative capacity to crack the code and solve problems. That's fluid intelligence, and that gets better and better from your 20s and 30s. And weirdly, it tends to peak in your late 30s or early 40s, and then it tends to decline. And he noticed this. Cattell noticed this, that these abilities tend to decline. Now, if you're really a striver and you're really good at what you do, and most of the people listening to us right now, they're good at something, they're really the only ones in their 40s who are going to notice these declines. And the way that you notice it is what people in the management world call burnout. So you find that your dentist, for example, when he's, let's say, 43, weirdly starts taking Fridays off to golf. Like, why would you do that? Do this trivial kind of hobby instead of doing something that you love, like being a dentist? And the answer is because humans aren't happy when they're not making progress. The mathematicians will put it that all of happiness is in the first derivative. All of happiness is in getting better. This is the reason, by the way, Sam, that it's very easy to lose weight, but it's very hard to keep weight off. Because when the scale's going down, you're motivated and happy, and it's when you hit your goal, the reward for hitting your goal is now you never get to eat the things you like ever again for the rest of your life. Congratulations. Yeah. And this is the nature of how we're wired. Progress is everything. And so what happens is that people get very frustrated and angry and desperate and afraid and sad when they're on the downslope of this fluid intelligence curve. What Cattell also pointed out is there's a second intelligence curve behind it that doesn't reward the same things. It's called crystallized intelligence, and it's based on all the things you know and how to use the things that you know. So your working memory is a lot worse. Your innovative capacity is worse. Your speed and your ability to solve problems is worse. But your wisdom is higher. Your pattern recognition is higher. Your vocabulary is higher. Your teaching ability is higher. And so what you need to do if you want to use that is actually start doing the things that favor that increasing intelligence. The great news, incredible news, is that crystallized intelligence increases through your 40s and 50s and even 60s and stays high in your 70s and 80s. So there's a guy at University of California at Davis, a guy named Dean Keith Simonton, who's the world's, I mean, I don't know if you've had him on your show. He's
No, I've read his books, but
He's wonderful. I mean, he talks about the cadence of creative careers, and he talks about the half-life, where he measures the corpus of work in quantity and quality of people in different creative careers. And he finds that those that load on fluid intelligence, like poetry, where you're just inventing stuff with words, that has a half-life around age 40, where you've done half of your lifetime work around age 40. When you think about it, T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, their best works were written in their late 20s and early 30s, and both guys lived into their 80s. Now, if you look at something that loads on crystallized intelligence, the body of knowledge and how to use it, like historians, they're basically just teachers. You have to have the New York Public Library in your head to be able to be a historian. Their halfway point is about age 65. So if you're a historian, take care of your health, because your best books are probably coming in your 80s. Is the point. And that's the difference between a career that loads on fluid and a career that loads on crystallized. Now, our job, you and me, is to be walking in our 40s and 50s from our fluid intelligence curve onto our crystallized intelligence curve by manifesting what we do in different ways. Probably that goes from writing mathematical theorems, which I was doing, to writing a column in the Atlantic and teaching at Harvard, which I'm doing now. This podcast that you're doing is like a master display in crystallized intelligence, because you're teaching with this particular podcast. This is a good thing that you're doing to favor what you're naturally getting good at in your 50s.
one likes to think. I mean, there's some skills that some career arcs that leverage crystallized intelligence much earlier, right? So where it's not so much about fluid intelligence. And then there's some careers where to move from fluid to crystallized, it really requires a fundamental change.
Yes.
You hit the ceiling, and now you're declining, and you're not going to be. I mean, there are examples of this in science. You single out Linus Pauling as one example of somebody. I mean, I guess this wasn't so much synonymous with a diminution in his abilities, although that could have been at the back of it. It was more just the his attachment to his own status and influence. He kept jumping on to one more lurid misuse of his abilities after the next, until he finally landed on mega doses of vitamin C.
We should probably, for people who don't know the Linus Pauling story, it's like, Linus Pauling, of course, won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for the nature of the chemical bond, which was just, if you don't have to be a chemist, his work in chemistry changed our lives in all sorts of ways, esoteric and not so much. Yeah. And then later on in life, look, the fluid intelligence curve is a fluid intelligence curve. You can't, he won the Nobel Prize for work he did in his 20s. They all win for work that they do in their 20s and 30s. They win it much later, usually, but it's for work that they do when they have this maximum amount of this incredible ability to focus and to use their unbelievable cognitive ability to greatest innovative ends. Well, later on in his life, just like the man behind me on the plane, or like so many other people, he was frustrated, obviously, and perhaps to keep the limelight or for whatever reason, he got more and more involved in activities that were really ostentatious and probably ill-advised. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work on the limitation of nuclear arms, but he took the Lenin Prize in the Soviet Union around the same time, and for the Lenin Peace Prize, really. And then later he went on to kind of a pseudoscience of massive doses of vitamins. He thought that vitamins could cure virtually all mental illness. He was also very interested in eugenics, and the idea that you could find the propensity to commit crimes, and you should put a tattoo on people for these. All kinds of stuff that's really anathema to what we think is moral and appropriate, but also scientific today. And you would say that he's a person who was just desperate to stay on the first curve, and he could have done a lot better by getting on the second curve. And so one of the things that I talk about in my work these days is how I can do it, how you can do it, and how everybody can do it by thinking about what is it in our lives that's more fluid and what's more crystallized. And so I talk about startup entrepreneurs. They're much better later in life as venture capitalists because they have perspective and they're teachers. But they're not going to be, sitting in a room 16 hours a day writing code, having people slip a pizza under the door. It's just not going to happen. If you're lawyers, for example, they're star litigators, ninjas, kind of like soul cowboys early on. And then later on, they make better managing partners. People are better as crack employees earlier, better as managers later. For people like you and me, we write the most innovative theoretical papers early in our academic careers, but we're much better explainers and teachers later on in our career. And each one of us can find our own crystallized intelligence curve. But if you don't, woe be unto you. If you stay handcuffed onto that fluid intelligence curve, you're going to write it down to the basement and feel aggrieved for the rest of your life.
How much of this is an actual difference in these subtypes of intelligence and how much of it is just energy and ambition and life circumstance. I mean, so many people delay having families. This was not, I guess this is not so true if you go back far enough in history, but now it's certainly true that there's a period in your 20s and even early to mid 30s where if you're playing an academic or entrepreneurial game and waiting for pizza to be pushed under the door, you very likely don't have kids. And again, you've got kind of endless energy just to burn the candle at both ends. How much of that is a variable here that could be confounding? How are you thinking about this?
Well, in the literature, as you can imagine, that's a big discussion. There is a work of both psychologists and neuroscientists that suggests that some of it is structural in the way that the brain works, but no doubt some of it is just the cadence of life. And part of the part that I find especially provocative and interesting is that I think that a lot of people, by the time they get into their 40s, have stopped falling for Mother Nature's tyrannical little trick, which is you're finally going to get that thing that you've always wanted, and it's going to be endlessly satisfying until the end of your life. After a while, you start saying, actually, that's not the new car smell isn't it? That if I get that thing that I want in my career, if I invent the theorem or get the patent or get tenure or whatever your thing is, or become the greatest French horn player in the world, if things have gone my way, that it's actually just not as satisfying as you think it's going to be, and not for very long, so that you start tempering your expectations that has to be part of it too. No doubt these are separable things, but they're complementary to each other. They exacerbate each other, and they make it impossible for you to be able to be this kind of fluid genius that you were early on the basis of, man, I'm gonna work till I drop.
What are your thoughts about identity here and the normative degree to which it can be diminished or appropriately linked to something in your life? I mean, I know you touch on this in the book, but I don't think there was a moment where I clearly understood whether or not you and I view this in the same way. I mean, just to give you my view, it feels to me, and this is, you'll detect the Buddhist influence here, that the sort of sanest relationship to identity is to basically have none, right? Or certainly to have none that is crystallized to any sort of point of being inflexible or, when challenged, becomes a source of suffering. Right, it's just like there's no version of a self-concept. Actually, you do at one point invoke the term, actually the Buddhist term, mana, which is usually translated as conceit, and I think you talk about it in the mode of the social comparison, right? Like comparing oneself favorably or unfavorably to others. And the insight here for me is that there really is no comparison to others that is a psychologically healthy basis for satisfaction. I mean, so like if you're comparing yourself unfavorably to others, well, obviously that hurts, right? You're feeling diminished by proximity to others. But comparing yourself favorably to others also is a very petty, morally impoverished place to be. I mean, just how much do you want your sense of well-being to be predicated on looking down on your friends? Noticing that you're smarter or richer or better looking than your friends. I mean, like, in what does your friendship consist, right? That's where you're finding your happiness. So it's just, my sense personally is that, and I think it's what I believe philosophically, is that you want the fumes of identity to fully dissipate, and it's immensely freeing on some level not to know who one is in the world. I mean, it's not that you want to be able to function. You don't want to have a kind of aphasia with respect to how you navigate social roles, right? I mean, you need to be able to say the appropriate and civil things on cue. You want to know, how to dress for dinner, but to wear whatever self-concept you have as lightly as possible, so that it really is just not the place from which you're relating to the next moment of experience. That's what seems optimal to me. Is there any way in which that you disagree with that?
No, there's no way that I disagree with that. I think that's exactly right. But I also will point out that is not human nature. And that brings me to my sort of overarching point, which is that Mother Nature doesn't care if you're happy. Mother Nature has other goals for you. And the great crossing of circuits in the human mind, as far as I'm concerned, is that we want to be happy, and we have urges for money and power and pleasure and fame. And the only way that we're going to know if we're successful along those dimensions is by comparing ourselves to other people. And we have brains, by the way. I mean, you can oxygenate your ventral striatum as well by having favorable social comparison as you can by taking methamphetamine. And you can get that, and it's a real reward, and people will be stuck on it, but it will not bring you ultimate happiness, because happiness is not something on which we're sorting. But Mother Nature is not actually giving us this imperative, this evolutionary imperative. That's the important thing to keep in mind, and I think that is entirely consistent with Buddhist teaching, also with Christian teaching. The idea that if it feels good, do it is not the best way to live your life. It's actually a foolish way to live your life. And that you need to be in charge. You can't let your feelings manage you. You should work to manage yourself and to manage your feelings. And there's interesting, because other traditions look at it in a slightly different way. One that I find especially useful is, the Hindus, they talk about Atman, which is the best way to think about it is in English, in the Western tradition, is that there's a difference between I and me. So I am an observer of the world. Me is an understanding of myself reflected through what Sam Harris thinks of me right now. And most people are all me and no I. Atman is the ultimate I. And the Hindus believe that only Atman can be in communion with Brahman, which is the Godhead. You can only really have a full communion with the universality of the true nature of things when you're just observing, as opposed to understanding yourself in the reflection of what everybody else thinks. And boy, oh boy, that's the reason that people say that, for example, Zen Buddhism isn't a philosophy or let alone a religion. It's an attitude. It's I-ness. It's outward-facing observation of the world. And I think that this is a really important ambition for all of us. If we want to be best we want to have the best nature, notwithstanding the fact that it's not very natural.
Okay, well, so we've landed on this this topic of religion, and no doubt my blasphemy or reputation for blasphemy will have preceded me. So
really? I'd never heard. Are you an atheist? I didn't know.
So you can anticipate we might disagree about a few things here, but I'm just wondering, there's probably some useful venting of our different perspectives here that we could indulge. Why is, on your view, faith the right gesture given our spiritual opportunities here? Why does this? Because perhaps describe what your relationship is to faith here, because obviously I know it because I've read your book, but the audience won't. And then tell me, what you mean by faith, and why is, because on my account, faith is, in the usual sense, something I think we need to overcome, as opposed to something that is the spiritual center of the bullseye. So tell me what you mean by faith and what your faith is.
So faith, I'm talking about it in different ways as a Christian and than I do as a scientist. So when I do my work, when I say faith, it's an abbreviation for living in a transcendental way. And so, for example, what you find is when you boil the ocean of all of the tens of thousands of studies at this point that talk about the habits and happiness of people, it's a very popular paper that I do. You do get survey data and you look at who's happy and you see how they live their life and you find these empirical results. And you can find, should you eat Brussels sprouts or broccoli? There's all kinds of marginality in there. But the big four are walking a transcendental life, which I'm going to argue that you do, and I do too, having a real sense of family life, friendship in a meaningful way, and then work that is other-focused, where you earn your successes with other people. Those are kind of the big four habits of the happy people. So starting with faith, which is what you just asked me about, I just put the word faith on it because faith, family, friends, I'm starting to get, it's sort of easy to remember. But what I really mean is getting your nose away from being pressed up against the canvas of life. Life is kind of a pointillistic painting. And if you're too close to it, you see a dot. And that dot is, Sam Harris, what he had for breakfast, and whether Martha Brooks is going to be on time for his podcast, and what the commute going to look like tomorrow at the airport, and on and on and on. And it's like watching the same episode of the same sitcom over and over and over again. It's unbelievably compulsive and tedious. And what you need is perspective and peace. And the way to do that is finding a way to zoom out, whether that's your meditation practice or being serious about the way that you walk in nature or analyze the works of Johann Sebastian Bach or practice a more traditional religious faith. You need perspective and peace about the why and zooming out. So that's the point. That's where you get the happiness benefit from what I talked about faith. I think there's lots of ways to do that. As a scientist, I think there's a lot of ways to do that. It doesn't mean they're all right. That's a completely different question, obviously. But from a psychological and probably neuroscientific perspective, there's lots of ways to actually get that part of the habits of happiness done. And so that's how I'm talking about it largely in my research work. In my personal life, the way that
actually,
I do that
before we jump to your personal life, I would just add that there are some other confounding variables in this research. And this is I guess an atheist hobby horse, but so all of the data that suggests that religious people are happier is, some of it I take as given. That it's not implausible to me that would be the case, given the psychological leverage of believing in specific things. I mean, I've long argued that there's nothing that takes the sting out of death quite so fully as a sincere belief that death is a total illusion and that you get everything you want after you die, right? I mean, if you really believe that, I have no doubt that you feel far less concerned about death than a person otherwise would. But the other variable here is community, right? And when you look at the kind of the breakdown of community in most secular contexts, and the atomization of everything, if you're sincerely religious people will tend to, if you're going to church every Sunday, you have a machine that is maintaining community for you, in addition to just all the shared beliefs. And it wouldn't be surprising that would lead to a higher self-measure of happiness in religious versus irreligious people.
Yeah, the way I'm talking about it though is that I separate out kind of in the right-hand side of the model the community part from the faith part. Mm-hmm. There's lots and lots of ways to get community. And by the way, I also have data that show that atheists and very serious religious believers have equal fear of death, which is to say, not. The people who are most afraid of death are people who have kind of lightweight religious beliefs that they don't live according to. Mm-hmm. And so it's really worth pointing out that it's worth believing something in action. That's an important thing to do, is to understand, to think seriously about what you believe and act according to it. But once again, what I believe that the big swinger is having a transcendental walk through life, is having a perspective on yourself. Look, if my life is all just Arthur Brooks, that sucks, man. I don't want that. That's boring. That's tedious. That's stressful. I mean, really, all the things that are happening in my life, this is what life is all about. I don't want any part of that. That's not meaningful. I want there to be meaning beyond the traffic coming in from the airport and what I'm digesting right now. I want bigger meaning than that, and I have to focus on that sincerely, and which you do and I do, and we do it in different ways. That's the point that I'm trying to make about this. Now, that's different than which perspective is more right in some cosmic sense. And I'm actually even not that concerned with it, but I do know that in my own life, the way that I practice this is I'm a Roman Catholic. I've been a Christian my whole life. And, now, since I've actually done the work as a scientist on it, I said, well, am I going to be serious about it or not? And so I do. And I go to Mass every day. And I practice it, and I pray my rosary, which is a form of meditative prayer, very much like I'm sure the meditation that you do. I mean, you probably get the same neuroscientific benefits from it. Probably the same thing is happening in our two brains as a result of it. And the one thing that I can't say is that I'm right, because I don't know if I'm right. The truth is I don't know if I'm right, but the transcendental walk makes me a lot more comfortable being in the zone of not knowing if I'm right, because that's kind of what the mystery of life is all about, is respecting the fact that we don't know. I can live with not knowing if I'm not too pressed up against the painting.
Has psychedelics been part of your adventure up until this point?
No. As a matter of fact, I don't take substances at all. And part of the reason is because I'm chicken. There's a lot of substance abuse problems in my family, and the stakes are high. And I realize that nobody gets addicted to psilocybin mushrooms. It's not the same thing as methamphetamine or opiates or alcohol. But the truth is, that's just not part of the equation for me. Now, we also know from a lot of the research that meditation and prayer, and especially meditative prayer, over the long haul has a lot of the same effects on the brain as psychedelics. Psychedelics might, for some people, be just more thrifty meditation.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just the only thing that produces a truly guaranteed result. I mean, every hour on the hour, whether it's you have a positive experience or a negative one, you're guaranteed to have a highly non-ordinary experience if you take the requisite dose of psilocybin or LSD. And that matters because there's so many people who just, and I count myself among these people, I think, but for some early experiences with psychedelics, I would have bounced off the whole project of having a spiritual life or practicing meditation, and I wouldn't have seen it there. I don't know. It's hard to know what the actual counterfactual is because I didn't have this experience. I came to it after I had an initial experience on the drug MDMA, and so what that experience taught me, really beyond any capacity for doubt, is that this is almost a tautology, but it taught me that it's possible to have a very different experience of being a mind in a world, right? Because I had just had one, and there was nothing about it being initiated by a drug that made it seem contingent upon drug use, right? I mean, it was just one of the hallmarks of the experience was, okay, this is in some ways this is more real than what I'm pretending. The person I'm going to become when the drug wears off is in many respects less of who I really am rather than more of who I really am. and the fact is that I'm just tending to be that person day after day is a pathology, really. And now I have to deal with that, and obviously I can't just keep taking MDMA every day. So what are the implications of having this recognition that, the ways in which I'm seeking happiness, the ways in which I'm tending to measure myself against others, the ways in which I'm defended and defensive, neurotic, nothing about this is normative, and there's got to be a way to outgrow this, in some way. And because I just experienced, 5 solid hours of being free of it, and it was,
Right.
it was a revelation. So yeah, I mean, that's the thing about psychedelics, from my point of view, it's not so much that they constitute a path for people to keep walking, but they can just show you beyond any capacity to doubt that the mind is not what you thought it was. Right.
Well, an important point, I think, is not that you come up with a different theory of what reality is, but that you question your own perception of reality. Most people go through life not questioning reality. And that's a mistake, because, there's all kinds of ways, there's all kinds of research that shows that what we see isn't true. We're missing things, and our interpretation of things are wrong because we have the ability to gate out all kinds of stimuli that are relevant, but we don't know which are relevant. I mean, the reality that we see is not objective reality. It's subjective reality on the basis of our circumstances. This is a fact, and there are all kinds of ways to bring this home, but you have a much richer understanding, a truer understanding of life when you're questioning. When you're questioning yourself, when you're interrogating your own reality with a suspicion, with a real skepticism of that. And that's what a great spiritual life can give you. And perhaps, one of the experiences that actually helped me about this a lot, and it's not a happy experience, was to see psychosis in my mother, because she was really great at illness. And when you're living with somebody, when you're close to somebody, when you love somebody who clearly sees things that don't exist, she was calling the exterminator every day because there were spiders all over her house. There was no spiders in her house, but she saw spiders. And when you see somebody who has a perception of reality that clearly isn't reality, and who has the same basic mind that you do, you become very skeptical of your own understanding of reality. And this is one of the things that I try to achieve in my spiritual life, in my meditative prayer practice. And what I ask God for is a greater understanding of my own limitations, is a greater skepticism, a greater ability to interrogate my own understanding, including my own understanding of spiritual reality. It's like we in the Bible, they say, I believe, Lord, help me, help my unbelief. But one of the ways you can help my unbelief is by fortifying my unbelief. This is where we can iterate into something that's just stronger and more secure, is to understand that we will be in a permanent state of skepticism of our belief. And that suspension itself, I think, is a really important part of human life.
All right, so let me present a case for atheism to you here as it sort of kindled for me while reading the book, because obviously I agree with basically everything in the book, and I recognize that we're describing in this conversation a common project, and yet the unrepentant and voluble atheist in me is still around, and I think it's important. So it's I'll just foist it on you and get your reaction. Because it's misunderstood, because obviously I have much more in common with you, I think, in every particular of this conversation than maybe even most of my fellow atheists do, right? It's like if you're talking to Richard Dawkins or James Dennett or Christopher Hitchens, as you know, I think for the purposes of describing a publishing phenomenon, treated like a four-headed atheist there for about 10 years. But, the real difference between us is that I have always had a conviction that there's a baby in the bathwater of religion that is not only worth saving, but it is in fact the most important thing in human life. And my gripe with religion is that religion most of the time doesn't even do a very good job of protecting that baby, and yet protects so many other things that are not only not important for its survival, but are creating immense harm, based on various irreconcilable dogmas out in the world. And so the baby for me really is the capacity for self-transcendence, for lack of a better word, and all of the normative, psychological, and ethical implications that follow from that. Right? So how is it that someone can be like Jesus or Buddha, whoever those historical figures actually were? There's no question that it's possible for someone to really experience a transformation of their own mind and life, and for that transformation to be durable and compelling to others, and become the basis of truly extraordinary wisdom and insight into the human condition. So I have no doubt about any of that. I think it's the most important human project. And yet, it's obvious to me, and it's a fairly strong, objective, if not arrogant claim of being right, or very likely right about this. It's obvious to me that this is a universal fact of the human mind, and it's therefore deeper than any contingency of culture, right? This is like physics, as opposed to being like one's taste in food or dress. Which is to say, the truths here are not merely made up by anyone, and they would be true whether or not anyone in any given generation could discover them. And so just as it would be crazy to be talking about Christian physics, just because it happens to be Christians who made the first breakthroughs in physics, it is in the end crazy to be talking about Christian spirituality. Because the real spirituality has to float free of all of the denominations, right? And there is no sectarian version of it, really. And I guess, that's a strong claim, but it's not the claim that rules out any attachment to or love of specific traditions. The truth is, I love Jesus in half his moods, and I love parts of the Bible, and I certainly love sitting in churches, and so it's just, I get all that, but I do view religious sectarianism as a real problem that we as a species have to outgrow, and we have to outgrow it intellectually, but we have to outgrow it for more urgent reasons, because people are still shattering our world over it. And so I guess I'm wondering why you don't see that possibility, and why you would want to identify as in any kind of sectarian way as I'm placing my bet on Roman Catholicism.
Right? To begin with, I'm delighted to know that you're truly an objectivist, that you're not an existentialist, you're not a subjectivist, you're not a Hegelian at all. I mean, you basically said there's an underlying reality. Yep. You're asserting an underlying reality. Now, if you were Sartre, you would say, what you basically said is that essence precedes existence, that we come into existence and there's an essence behind it, and that we're struggling to find it, and we're struggling in different ways to find out that essence. I mean, all of the existentialists, except for perhaps Kierkegaard, talked about the fact that there is no essence, that we exist, and that we are obligated morally to figure out what the essence, what the meaning is. And if we don't find it, well, then we're just nihilists, sort of Nietzschean in this particular way. And that's obviously not what you think. So you're a lot
Well, I would
closer.
I would just add one caveat there. One footnote is that certain things are obviously culturally constructed, and so that is their essence, right?
Sure.
It's not that,
Sure.
you can be a realist and admit, all this category of things that we do in fact.
Right, like language, for example. Nobody thinks that but there's some basic symbols around life, and our languages are all struggling to describe many of the same sets of experiences. And I think that your point is that that's what all of these spiritual and non-spiritual but transcendental traditions are trying to do, is they're a curve fit. This is an interesting thing about, statistics is a curve fit to some underlying reality. Physics, Newtonian physics, very imperfect, is a curve fit to the underlying properties of how the natural world works. And so is Einsteinian physics, and so is Higgs boson, and whatever comes later is going to get to be a better and better curve fit. And if that's the case, then what we're looking at is different systems of spiritual physics to get at some better underlying phenomenon. It's interesting also, my father grappled with this. He was a PhD biostatistician. He, in his dissertation work, he wrote biostatistical theory. I mean, he's a big brain guy. And he used to say that, that he was also a serious Christian his whole life. I mean, and he used to say, the most beautiful thing that God created was the standard normal distribution, such that his miracles are things that are 3 standard deviations away from the mean. He believed that it was a miracle of God's nature to create randomness in the universe. Now, this is antithetical to the way that a lot of deterministic Christians see the world, but what it suggests is that those aren't the only way to see the world. These are different languages for struggling to see what the realities, the underlying objective realities might be, and what our experience of them might be. We don't know if one is more right than another. I have the appropriate humility to know that I don't have some special knowledge. I don't have any special knowledge at all. But I also understand that I am born in a particular place, such that I'm from Seattle, Washington, and I grew up with a West Coast accent in English, and these are the circumstances under which I can grapple with the realities that somebody who has more or less the same realities as a human person in Calcutta would have it. I love going to Calcutta, but that's not my home, and that's not the vernacular that I've learned. This is not the language that I can use to apprehend what I hope are the Platonic shadows on the cave wall. We have to find some way to do this. Now, what you rightly object to in the way that people live their religious experience is the dogma to say, my way is inherently right. There's no way I'm making any mistake, and so therefore I'm going to denigrate or even harm you. And that's, I think, not necessary. Mother Teresa, Saint Teresa of Calcutta, was asked, how come you're palling around with all these gurus? All these, Jains and Parsis and Hindus and Buddhists. She said, I love all religions, but I'm in love with the Catholic faith. And that's how I feel. I'm in love with the Catholic faith. And I love, Sam, I love how you think. And I don't think it's that different.
Yeah, although I feel like there's an opportunity to fly free of some of the contingencies you just mentioned. So, for instance, take something like romantic love, right? Which is, it's not the totality of love. It's not even the most important part of love, but it's, romantic love is a thing that people value. It's a phenomenon psychologically and socially. It's important. It moves a lot in our world. And people spend an inordinate amount of time focused on it and dealing with its aftermath, etc. Now, we could live in a world where a majority of people not only thought about romantic love in all the usual ways, but they thought that it was under the control of Cupid, right? That's
right.
Possible. There's a history and mythology around that, and it just by sheer, in my view, by sheer luck, it's not a staple of anyone's religious fixation and concern now. I would imagine there's virtually no one taking Cupid seriously.
Oh, I bet there's a few.
There's got to be a few, but it's what one wonders whether they're just putting us on. But there's nothing about the story of Cupid or the invisibility of Cupid that when you compare it to other religious beliefs just cries out, well, this is obviously a fraud, right? It's totally possible that there's some alternate, world where Cupid would be a major concern for all of us, and we would have, rival sects that were annihilating one another because of different interpretations of the literature around Cupid, or different claims about how many arrows he has in his quiver, et cetera, et cetera. And it's hard for me to see that our world would be better. In fact, I think it would be much worse if most talk about romantic love most of the time was encumbered by very strong claims about the necessity of believing in Cupid and propitiating him, and just how old is he, and how, did you actually catch a sight of him, and how do you know it was a real arrow from Cupid and not a fake arrow? So, there could be a literature around all of that, and there could be college courses taught on it, and all of that would be misspent energy, and yet the reality of love is there to be contemplated and experienced and dealt with, and we're better to do that in a truly transcultural and modern way rather than to be trotting out ancient Romans and Greeks to help us on that topic. And
yeah,
so
let me push back on that a little bit, Sam, because I think that there's all kinds of reason that we want to use symbols and analogies to understand concepts that are true, that really are essence that precedes existence. So in the case of romantic love, for example, I talk about I teach romantic love to my students at Harvard, and I talk about it using analogy constantly. I talk about the neurochemical cascade that happens with testosterone and estrogen and norepinephrine and dopamine, and when serotonin falls and makes you infatuated, and finally when you have the love of your life because of the oxytocin that binds us together, and there's all kinds of ways to describe that. I talk about dopamine is like the tide coming in, and when the tide goes out, you better have oxytocin on the beach or there's nothing left. And how do you get these types of things? And I use other symbols like language, for example. There's all kinds of reasons to use poetry to get ideas across. The problem is getting hung up on the poetry itself as opposed to the underlying truths, the underlying concepts. And that's the important thing. It's when we talk in the Christian faith about romantic love, the important thing is that we believe that the creator, that there is creative force in the universe that's based on love, and that's refracted in the way that we understand each other. That the Greeks who have something like 11 words for love. They're different refractions of the most cosmic love that exists, and that's Christians would call that God's love. And the love that I have for my wife is a simulacrum for God's love because I'm made in God's image. Now, I don't know exactly the literality of this. I can't judge that, but I do know that this is an incredibly effective way for me to understand what I believe is the cosmic truth of the universe. And it's not the only way I understand, and other people will object and think there are better ways. I like my way, and if you wanted to become Catholic, I'd sponsor you. I would love that. I would like nothing more. But the point is that why? The answer is because I love you and I want you to be happy. Because that's my role as a human being. That's my meaning as a human being. And the way that I learn that is through these symbols that we're talking about, that are the basis of my religion and the basis of your ethical system. And we're converging on the same set of ideas, and that's really important.
Yeah, I guess for me the difference is just that I want to. So I'm very Catholic in the in the small C sense of just wanting to be able to sample from all of the world's great literature and traditions and just take the best ideas as I find them and use them. And their provenance ultimately is not what's important, right? And
yeah, sure. And I want the same thing, except that the way that I do that slightly differently is that I want the world's traditions and I incorporate them into my technique in a way. So, I studied meditation, sat in meditation with the Tibetan Buddhist Dharamsala. It made me much better at praying my Catholic rosary. I mean, I understand breath better. I understand the role of heartbeat better. I understand my posture better. And the result is, I'm a better Catholic. And I've discussed it with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I say, what do you want me to do? And he says, I want you to be a perfect Catholic. and the reason is because it's really the same thing I think that you're saying. I think that at the end of the day, we're weirdly close to each other on this, and we can get stuck in the details. We can get stuck in the details where I say that, look, Sam, you're not doing this, that, and the other thing, so you're completely 180 degrees off the truth. I don't think that's right, actually.
What I'm hearing here is more of a, it's somewhat analogous. This may sound like it trivializes it, but it's not meant in that spirit, but it's somewhat analogous to just picking your favorite sports team and just loving, so like you're a soccer fan, you just love Manchester United, and you're going to root for them. And you're going to take that seriously in the sense that it can occupy a lot of your life, and you get immense joy from it. But when push comes to shove, you're really not going to argue that someone is wrong to love Liverpool or some other team, right? Like they're playing a different game. It's like the Dalai Lama saying, I want you to be the best Manchester United fan you can be, even though I love Liverpool. But that's not what the real traditions have been, and it's not what the traditions are for many people. I mean, that's for most, but I guess a lot of this gets distilled for me in a person like Aquinas, who you mentioned many times in the book, and without always favorably, but for Aquinas, for me, represents a kind of missed opportunity, and I think I'm certainly not a scholar of Catholicism or Aquinas, but in my understanding of his life, in some sense, I think he is supposedly recognized a missed opportunity in his own life. And so, for instance, I think at the end of his life, he's reported to have looked back upon all of his writing and casuistry as just, I think the quote is, as so much straw.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. But he
then
had
he fell
vision.
silent.
Well, he had a vision he had a beatific vision. He had a mystical beatific vision, and he found that all of his words and symbols paled in comparison with the reality, with the cosmic reality, which is so important, because of course that's true, because of course your curve fit is going to be inaccurate. It stands to reason that it's all so much straw. I mean, I think that, if there is some version of the beatific vision for Sam and Arthur at some point, that we're going to be laughing hysterically at our lame sort of ham-fisted attempts to get at the cosmic realities of what's going on here, because we can't look. I mean, we talked about that before. We know that even if there is reality, which I suspect that there is, that we don't see it. We're just doing our best.
No, I'm making a more overweening claim than that. I mean, I see enough of it to know that certain things are definitely wrong, right? Like for instance, the thing with Aquinas is, I mean, he as you know, he spent an inordinate amount of his intellectual energy and his prodigious intellectual energy and talent on questions like, what would happen to cannibals on the day of resurrection, right? Because if cannibals are busy eating people and God has to resurrect the bodies of all the people, and the body of one person has been incorporated into the body of a cannibal, who gets resurrected, right? So like that, from my point of view, is just might have been fun for him to do, but there are better uses of his intellect then and now. But even more important, Aquinas thought heretics should be put to death, and his reasoning on that score was definitely instrumental in giving us the Inquisition for centuries in Europe. And his reasoning is understandable, given that he thought there was only one true way to salvation. Right? I mean, like, I think the analogy he draws, correct me if I'm wrong, but he talks about, like, he said something like, we put counterfeiters to death. And how much more grave is the sin of counterfeit spiritual teaching. These aren't his words, but this is the sentiment. He's like, this is, of course, if you're going to put counterfeiters to death for merely debasing the currency, of course we're going to put heretics to death for debasing the one true path to God. And if you actually believe that the stakes are that high, is understandable, right? I'll bite the bullet there and say, yes, if in fact it is the one true path to God, well, then there's really nothing more grave than leading my children astray on that score, right?
Right. But there's one thing that's worth pointing out about Aquinas as well. I mean, that's you see that in Aquinas, but you also notice that Aquinas relied on the writings of Plato and Aristotle, who were pagans.
Yeah.
And so did St. Augustine, who was just as starchy as they get in his writings. They talked about the pagans as actually having, godly truth. And this is, Thomas Merton talked about the Buddha. And the truth is that we're all effectively trying to adhere to the tradition and the language that we have, and at the same time trying to get the best from other places. And that's the kind of flexibility that I think we should encourage with everybody. What can I learn from you, and at the same time becoming a better version of me in trying to understand the reality around me in a cosmic sense? It's interesting. You get kind of I teach at the Harvard Business School, so forgive me. We think the whole world is organized into a 2x2 matrix. Mm-hmm. And, there's my belief and your belief. And the way that I can organize it is if whether I know what I believe to be true or whether I'm not sure, and whether I think that what you believe is wrong or whether I'm not sure. And everybody kind of falls into one of these quadrants. And, the truth is, I believe that the things that are my beliefs, I'm confident in them, but I don't necessarily know if you're wrong. And that's very different than being I'm not sure about my beliefs, but I sure think Sam's wrong. And that's one of the things that actually leads to the most bitterness, the most disagreement that we actually see in these religious debates and these very hardcore, arguments between atheists and Christians and atheists and people of other religions today. Is what they're really arguing about is I'm not so sure about what I think, but I'm sure that you're full of it. I'm sure that you're completely wrong. And I think it's better to start from the humility that says, I am willing to throw in with my own beliefs, but I'm not willing to throw out yours. I think that's a much better way to start, because then I can learn from you. And in learning from you, I can actually be at peace and in communion with you, and I can become a better version of myself with my own beliefs.
I guess my foundational claim here is that belief is the wrong tool for the job. Right, thought itself is the wrong tool for the job, and my sense of what spirituality really is, or what the ever-present opportunity is to move beyond our concepts and however we acquired them, and simply experience consciousness in the present moment in all of its depth, and that's the transcendental or self-transcending aspect to it. And I know that's not, I know that is a part of the apogee of Christian practice as well. I mean,
Sure.
that prayer and silence. And when you look at did you see that documentary Into Great Silence about the Carthusian monks outside of Grenoble?
No, I can't do that. I need to, right?
Yeah, it's an amazing documentary. It's mostly silent, you're just following these monks through their day, and they're in the most picturesque monastery you've ever seen in the mountains of France. And actually, there's a point of contact with the Dalai Lama, because I saw this monastery on a day off from bodyguarding the Dalai Lama. I went to this monastery, and you can't actually get in. So a friend and I were just looking at this amazing place. It's just in this deep valley between snow-capped mountains, and it's been there, I think it's close to 1,000 years old. I mean, it's just, there have been monks in there continuously praying for many, many generations. And anyway, in the middle of our contemplating this, a helicopter arrives and lands on the lawn, and the Dalai Lama gets out and gets whisked into the monastery. So he got a good look at the inside. But when I look at how those men have lived their lives in silence and in perpetual routine and ritual and prayer, of course, moving beyond belief and having some kind of profound engagement with the profundity of the present moment, that has to have been what was on the menu and what they were experiencing.
For sure. And by the way, this is the same thing we were talking about before. The point is Atman, is I-ness, not me-ness. Belief, when I say my belief versus Sam's belief, I'm bouncing my beliefs off you and understanding myself in the context of our differences. And that's social, that's comparison, that's human comparison, which is necessarily through a glass darkly. That's a problem, because that just leads layer after layer after layer of inaccuracy. We are looking for the ultimate observation where we have a complete humility, the emptiness that basically says that is a level of comfort with, Lord, I don't know. And Lord, help me to be fully alive despite the fact that I don't know, and to be comfortable with it. It's interesting. You know, I've walked the Camino de Santiago twice, which is a profoundly contemplative experience. It's just the best thing ever.
It sounds amazing. I have a friend who's walked it.
Yeah, and what you do is that you beat yourself into submission of I-ness. That's what happens, because you just can't do anything except walk. You know, you don't have your devices, you're not talking on the telephone if you have any sense about you, and you think about the trivialities of, you know, my legs hurt and the dirt on my shoes in prayer and worship and contemplation. And what that does is it makes it possible for you to live a little more monastic existence and to have a walking meditation, et cetera, et cetera. So the technique is obvious. But what that does is it gets you away from the meanness and toward the I-ness, such that a lot of the differences, the sectarian differences that we're talking about, I don't know about their legitimacy, but they become irrelevant because you have a purer understanding of what you're trying to do with your faith in the first place.
Well, Arthur, it's great to connect. I don't think we're going to resolve all of the mysteries and paradoxes of our viewing the world at all differently, but to be continued. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Me too, Sam. I really appreciate the work that you're doing to bring these ideas to people in really vivid form, and I'm a fan.
Likewise. I recommend people pick up the book if we did not exhaust its contents, and that is From Strength to Strength.
Thanks, Sam. Talk to you again soon, I hope.
Summoner's Rift. "30 seconds until minions spawn." A summoner has reconnected. Minions have spawned. A summoner has disconnected. A summoner has reconnected. A summoner has disconnected. 30 seconds until minions spawn. Minions have spawned. Shut down. Rampage. Your team has destroyed. Shut down.